Okay, I'm on. I see myself on.
Hi, Oba.
Hey, how you doing, Dorothy?
Okay, how are you?
Good.
Dr. Tashaka, good to see you. It's been a
Good seeing
while.
you. How you doing?
I'm good.
All right, on. Start your video.
I was one of your students.
Okay, right on.
Yeah,
How you doing?
history study, my first teacher.
Okay.
Okay, I'm watching this in my world.
Oh, right on.
Yeah.
Hey, Petrie, how you doing?
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm doing okay, sir.
Well,
I
I'm
tried to
glad
send
you.
you email one time to thank you for your education, but the email bounced back.
Okay. Well, I'll give it to you. So you probably didn't get mine.
Okay.
Somebody else's. Yeah, right on.
Okay, thank you.
Tanika, how you doing?
Dr. Tashaka, I graduated with a 4.0. Thank you for your help back then.
Oh, right on. That was better than mine. You beat me.
Thank you for everything, Dr. Tashaka. Can I tell people what you did for me?
Sure.
Back when I was an undergrad in 1999, I became a mom, unwed mom. And I came to Dr. Tashaka. I was taking his Black oratory class. I loved it. But as a speech major, I had some ideas. So I approached Dr. Tashaka and asked him if I could teach his class because I had some ideas. He said he never had a student who offered to take over his class before, but he gave me a chance and I taught the class in his absence. And then I also helped facilitate his Black political movements. But even more than that, when me and my little girls, when we were homeless, Dr. Tashaka opened up his house to us. And both my oldest daughter, she graduated last year. And the second one, she graduated this spring, Dr. Tashaka. Thank you for everything.
Oh, yeah, I'm going to cry in a minute. That's beautiful.
Right on.
Thank you.
Yeah, so what are you doing now?
I'm actually a student again. I'm in the multiple subject credential program. I decided to pursue being an elementary school teacher.
Right on.
Great. Yeah.
So you're a perpetual student.
I am a lifelong learner.
You know,
That's
one of my students called me a perpetual activist.
That's you, absolutely.
And I thought that was funny because it's kind of like you're perpetually alive. To me, that's just normal. You know what I mean?
Yes,
But
absolutely.
for them, coming from another generation, oh, there's somebody who's continuing on. I said it's kind of like a zoological description, but it was a compliment.
Yes, yes,
So
it
that's
never
good.
stops.
Yeah, you never stop learning. You know?
Never. Thank you
Wow.
again.
Hey, nice.
So thank each of you for, that was a really beautiful intro, and I think it ties very well with the welcome and introduction. I mean, you said it best, the power of Black studies and what it can mean. And so we want to welcome each of you to tonight's event. This event is a part of what we call the Nathan Hare Black Power Speaker Series. The series was developed out of the desire to honor the legacy of Black studies here at San Francisco State University. And so we're so honored to have Dr. Tashaka, who will be speaking on the legacy of Black studies. There's a saying, there were people walking in darkness that have seen a great light. And a part of that great light has been Black studies, Africana studies, the power of Black studies to transform not only individuals, but communities. We see it in the transformation of people's personal lives. We see it as we look at movements, entire movements that have been developed from the struggle of Black studies that today lend itself to helping us to look anew at our humanity. And so we're so grateful to have all of you here today to hear about this legacy of Black studies here at San Francisco State University. And so what we're gonna do is we're gonna have Dr. Saruta to give a formal introduction to our guest speaker. And then from there, we will Dr. Tashaka will do a presentation, a discussion, and we'll open it up for questions and answers and responses and have a conversation with this great icon tonight. Dr. Tashaka and I have had some conversation over the last couple of weeks, and I was excited to know that he's originally from my home state. His father is from Louisiana, and so when he asked me where I was from, I didn't really understand why he was asking, because I'm like, I'm from Opelousas, you won't know where that is. And he says, oh, my dad is from Bunkie. And Bunkie it just happened the day he asked me, the night before, I was having a conversation about Bunkie, because there was a great event that took place in Bunkie. And so thrilled to have Dr. Tashaka and thrilled to have all of you. Dr. Saruta, I'll turn it over to you. Thank you.
Welcome. I'm glad to be speaking to introduce my dear friend, Oba, who's like a brother. He has written several books. I want to kick it off, though, picking up about the perpetual activist. As a professor emeritus who spent his entire teaching career at San Francisco State, Dr. Tashaka is like a role model for how to retire and continue as emeritus to support the department. Every time there's anything that comes up that we need help or thinking about, we know we can call Dr. Tashaka. He's just that kind of human being. As he said, the activism, I think, is something inside you from birth. Activism on behalf of your people. It's inside you from birth. I believe he was born with it, this commitment to community from birth. He's written several books. He's got, I think Dr. Tashaka is a podcast where every Sunday you have a program. He has a program every Sunday. And he still continues to take up important topics that we're dealing with in the community. So he's been, if you look on our Africana Studies website, you'll see a history of the department that he wrote and that we keep there because it's the most profound statement of the founding of the department. He has fought battles to keep the department. I mean, the 68 strikers made it possible to get it. And Oba Tashaka, I'm saying, is the prime person who fought the administration and made it possible for it to continue. And he passed the baton on to me. And as he told me, he could retire knowing somebody will continue it. He's my role model. He's my friend. And he's the husband of a beautiful woman that I've also become friends with. So I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Tashaka to speak, but just know that you're looking at, well, a human monument. You know, we look at buildings and we say, oh, that's a national monument. Dr. Tashaka is somebody, as we've already heard, who's actually a human living monument of what it means to be an activist on behalf of your own people. And I'm honored to have been able to work with him and to have his respect.
Thank you, Dorothy. You know, I love you. We're buddies, and we can have some long conversations, and especially when some serious stuff comes up, I'll be like her psychological counselor, and sometimes she's mine. And I want to say that Dr. Saruta has done great work in keeping the department strong. When she came in, you know, she saw to it that unity was maintained in the department, and she was chair for 14 years. I was chair for 12. And it's not an easy thing, chairing Black Studies. And Dr. Petrie probably is just beginning to see that. But since you've had COVID-19, you get a certain kind of break. And then after a while, that's going to hit you. So I want to say to students that are watching this and anyone from the community, I understand that you have some people from the community who are also watching this, welcome. And Dr. Petrie, I've heard that you're doing a good job. You're an even captain of the ship. You know how to be cool, and being a Southern Black man, you know some things about handling our people, and that's real important. So this is a pleasure to share some things with you. The title for my topic today is the Black Freedom Movement and the Black Power Movement's role in giving birth to Black studies and providing really its purpose. Because we often think of the purpose of Black studies coming from the institution. It came from the community, and it came from struggle. So for those that don't know who I am, I'm a former student of San Francisco State. I graduated in 1961 as a government and pre-law major. I have a Ph.D. in philosophy from the Western Institute for Social Research in Berkeley, and I was the leader of the San Francisco Freedom Movement, one of the Black movements that contributed to the birth of Black studies at San Francisco State. And this is a key thing I really want to stress. No Black freedom movement, no Black power, no Black studies. That's the mama, you know? And then Black studies is the child. And in my second presentation, I'll talk about the adult that grows out of Black studies. That's the African-centered component. So I walked the strike every day of the strike and did not lead it, the students led it. And to them, we owe the birth of Black studies, as they owe the consciousness they gained from the movements that birthed their consciousness. I've taught 16,000 students in the course of 40 years, and I've learned from them, because teaching is learning. And a good teacher is a student, a good student's a teacher. And so I owe a lot of my development to my students. I'm the author of 5 books, and I have a weekly show on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Comes on every Saturday at 10 a.m. in the morning, called the Dr. Over Tashaka Show. It's been on for a year and 4 months, and it's my way of transmitting to the younger generation, and my viewing audience starts at age 35, my lessons, and then we have masters who come on who share their lessons, and then we learn from our youth. So my presentation today is going to cover 2 things. One, the birth and history of Black studies and its purpose. That's the second, the purpose. So to understand the history and purpose of Black studies, you got to put it within the historical context of the 50s and the 1960s. Black studies as a discipline at 4-year colleges and junior colleges could not happen in the United States, in the Caribbean, or in Africa prior to the 60s, because in Africa, Africans were under colonialism. In the Caribbean, Africans were under colonialism, and Blacks until the mid-50s were under a vicious system of Southern apartheid. And sometimes that also affected the minds of the people who were being colonized and oppressed. But the conditions did not permit us to have the power to do what we did in the 50s and in the 60s. So this is a key thing to understand. No African independence movement, for that matter, no Asian independence movement, no revolution in Cuba, no Black studies. So don't think we just stepped up, and suddenly we could create Black studies. there was a context. It was a world context. So to understand the history of Black studies, you need to know that it is the product of a successful revolt, a revolt of Africans in Africa against colonialism, a revolt of Africans in the United States in the South against Jim Crow or Southern apartheid or segregation. And in San Francisco, maybe one reason you could have the first successful Black studies movement is you had the only successful Black freedom movement in the United States, in the North, in the 60s. And I was proud to lead it. And so success breeds success. And I always say this, people need victories. You don't need to enter into battle and get your behind whipped. I've been in battle 62 years and have lost no battles. Kicked corporate behind, CIA and FBI behinds, and administration behinds at San Francisco State University, which is easy. Because if you know how to beat the corporations and you can beat the FBI and CIA, this stuff here is a cakewalk. You hear me? So, but I want to say that I owe everything I have to my movement that I was proud to lead, but it taught me because we had a team of people, and to my people who are our real teachers. So this is really part of the background for Black studies and what is now Africana studies. So put it another way, Black studies as a movement and as a discipline was the result of Black people successfully wielding power over their white oppressors. Because please believe me, just as they don't want us here, you know, in America, I'm just talking about they don't want us, you understand? They surely didn't want a rigorous discipline implanted on the campus. If they were gonna have one, they wanted a, hope you all understand this old expression, a handkerchief head discipline. A scraping discipline, a grinning discipline, a discipline that talked loud, as James Brown said, and said nothing. That's what they would have liked, but that's not what they got because we came out of a power base that it woke us up. So with the conquest of Africa and the Caribbean and the oppression of Blacks in the United States under Jim Crow, and in the North under de facto segregation, which we still live under, we were put in the position where our oppressors, in controlling our present, could control the narrative on our past and literally write us out of history. Even though we had a history, we got written out. So today, even too many Black people express their plantation mentality, even though we're in a new reality, by still denying their history, denying their historical roots, by saying things like, I didn't lose anything in Africa. Malcolm X had an answer to this. He said, you lost your mind in Africa. If you're crazy enough to think that you didn't lose anything in Africa, which is about the highest achievements of civilization in the world. No Chinese person would say that. No Japanese person would say that, but that slave conditioning would lead you to say that. And some of us still say that. Some of our parents tell our students, don't take that black mess, not knowing this is the study of you. And you ain't no mess. I hope you aren't. I'm joking. So the process of enslavement created a condition of historical amnesia. In fact, the United States of America, as Gore Vidal once said, America's so-called historian for white people, and a radical and good one, he said the US of A means United States of amnesia. So white people pretty much believe whatever is told to them in the movies or television. And we had induced amnesia caused by the history of enslavement. where we got the false images of Africa, and we were told savages in Africa, slaves in America. And some of us still believe it. And so too many of us still have our minds on a plantation, and as a result are under remote control. So when you're powerful, you understand that your history is the key to your power. Knowing it is the key to your power. And when you know it, when you know the power that you once have, you have a sense of the power that you can have today and tomorrow. And so any people who are satisfied with being ignorant of their history have put themselves in a position of being oppressed. And sometimes they won't even know they're being oppressed, because sometimes your enemy will grin at you and oppress you. And so you have a lot of these grinning enemies sitting in your house. John Fitzgerald Kennedy, who grinned at you and didn't do anything until the end of his life, and he died before he can even get on the books civil rights legislation when Blacks put him in office, you know? So sometimes we don't even know that the person who's grinning at us is getting ready to skin us because we don't know our history. So Black studies rises out of the power of Africans in the 60s in Africa, the Caribbean, the United States. And we can say this: no Black studies outside of this global rise of Africans and people of color in the world, and no rise of Africa without the powerful ideas of Africans in America, particularly the idea of Pan-Africanism, which comes out of in the minds of enslaved Africans who, though enslaved, knew they were Africans. And in the 20th century, give birth to the idea of one Africa. That comes from the United States, and it comes from the Caribbean, particularly Trinidad. And so this is part of the root of Black studies. The successful battles for African independence and the successful battles against segregation in the South, and particularly the successful battle in San Francisco against economic apartheid, was a part of a broader movement that included the Black Panther Party, that stood up against the police and demonstrated the bravery of young Black people who had no fear of the odds. It was a part of a little known group that was partner to the group that I was in, Congress of Racial Equality, the Deacons for Self-Defense, that came out of Louisiana. One of my good friends in the Deacons, his name was Chilly Willie, 6'1", Black and beautiful. When women saw him, they just shake, Chilly Willie. And the Deacons were armed. And when I moved into Bogalusa, Louisiana, I had Deacons self-defense surrounding me. And my girlfriend had already brought me some protection. She knew I needed more than a prayer in the Deep South. You know what I'm talking about? So this movement that gives birth to Black studies is a part of a big movement of the uprising of Africans in the world. And one of its intellectual leaders was the bad brother called Malcolm X, El-Hajj Malik El-Shabazz. Malcolm was a big influence on the Black freedom movement, but we were a big influence on him. And the group that I come out of, C.O.R.E, had the biggest influence on him because we were based in the North, where the Nation of Islam was based. And so Malcolm began to think more like us, just as we began to think more like him. It was an interchange going on there. So these psychological transformations created the mindset that could enable students to later on take entrenched power at the university level, in this case at San Francisco State. Now let's get something else straight. The first Black Studies curriculum did not start in the university. In fact, this was true in different parts of the country, but I'm speaking from the perspective of the San Francisco Freedom Movement. Our university was the University of Fillmore Street. Y'all get this straight? Our teachers were everyday Black people in the Black community and our corporate enemies, because we tackled with the biggest powers on earth, the corporations. And so those are really the two best enemies in life, your people and your enemies. You learn a lot from both. And don't think that you don't learn anything from your enemy. I mean, if you think your enemy has nothing to teach you, you'll get whipped. 2 rules in war: know yourself, know your enemy. So the Black Freedom Movement in the North, and particularly the San Francisco Freedom Movement, it was the streets where we carried out our actions, and mainly Fillmore Street that was our base, that was our university in the community. We had a 6-year movement, 10,000 people at its peak. And so what we learned from our people and from the corporations that we tangled with became the best education of our lives. In fact, my education on the streets taught me to throw away most of the white miseducation I got at San Francisco State, because I found that it was basically based on a tissue of lies. And that was my awakening. And it had to be, because if I'm tangling with the biggest corporations on the planet, and I don't know how the country is run, and my government administration major lied to me, all these courses were based on a tissue of lies that America's a democracy, America's a hypocrisy, and the corporations run all of it. In other words, money and institutional power runs everything, you know? So it was that education that was the best education of my life, caused me to hit the books and caused me to become a scholar of what we now call Black Studies. But that was not just true for me. That was true for many activists coming out of the movement. Now in 1960, this is true across the country, especially where Blacks are living in areas where you didn't have manufacturing industries still going after World War II. Most Blacks in most urban communities, this was especially true in San Francisco, were shut completely out of the white corporate economy. We had businesses in the Black community, but these businesses were starving because Blacks didn't have jobs at the end of World War II. The defense jobs had shut down. And so the only jobs Blacks had in San Francisco were on the waterfront, where my father worked, the post office, shining shoes, working as doormen for hotels, and our women working in white women's homes. Sound familiar? So literally, economic apartheid shut us out of any kind of livelihood. This was true for brown and yellow people as well. They had their community to rely on. Whatever businesses they had, that was it. They were shut out of this corporate economy as well. So I've been an organizer now for 62 years. And all I'll say is the lessons I learned out of this Black Freedom Movement, of all the organizing I've done, it was the richest. Leading the San Francisco Freedom Movement, I learned more lessons than in any other movement because of the nature of the 60s, because our people had rose up in the South and were rising up in different parts of the country. And so that classroom that it created led us to raise big questions and come up with big answers. So the San Francisco Freedom Movement, while it was headquartered in San Francisco, we defeated employers throughout the Bay Area in 12 cities and throughout the state of California, from Northern California to Southern California. This is no small matter, since California is the largest state in the United States. And given the relatively small number of Black people in California, We didn't just beat them because we had numerical power. We beat them with strategy. You hear me? And I'm going to say this, next to God and love, the ultimate art is strategy. And if a movement doesn't have strategy, it's dead in the water. You hear me? Strategy is the ultimate art. And the ultimate art of strategy is winning without a fight. That will mystify some of you. But that's the art, baby. Most of my battles have been won without a fight. That's the art. You hear me? America is declining because they've gone around the world and bloodied itself and bloodied the world and lost and gone into decline after 27 years. Bad strategy. You hear me? Bad. And quit calling this white supremacy. They're not supreme anymore. They're going down. What makes them sad makes me glad. But if you identify with this, you're going to think you're going down. But that's a question of whether you're on the plantation or you're about to build your own sense of self-determination. Huh? You know what I'm talking about? So we're the only Black freedom movement and Black power movement in the United States that didn't lose a battle and defeated an entire economic power structure. I didn't have time to put up PowerPoint because it would have taken time away from, because I'm on strict orders on my time. But the next time I'll show you some stuff on the PowerPoint. But we produced thousands of jobs for Blacks and people of color. It wasn't just Blacks, because when you open up jobs for Blacks, then other people who are shut out are also deserving. So Asians, Latinos, and probably a few Native Americans. So we defeated industries and we defeated business associations. I'm the strategist. That's my second love to the truth is strategy. Everything I do is strategy. My wife said I can't use strategy on her. I said, huh? That's one of the ultimate arts you better use it on, because that's your lifelong partner. You better make the right decision there. You make that decision wrong, everything else is a mess. You hear me? I can't help it. Everything I do is strategy. So I told our people, we ain't taking on no individual businesses. We're taking on industries. We're taking on business associations, and I won't go into how we took them apart. That's a whole nother story. So we beat the Retail Dry Goods Association that represented all the department stores, whipped them. It took about 3 months. We defeated the major supermarkets, all the major supermarkets in the Bay Area, around 12 cities. And the principal ones, Lucky's and Safeway, and those were the best jobs, union jobs, medical benefits, and retirement. And by the way, the people in our movement, we had an unspoken rule. We take none of those jobs. They weren't for us. And I had plenty of unemployed members or underemployed, cab drivers, whatnot. You know what I mean? I was unemployed, but I was a student. You know what I mean? So, I mean, I can't be saying I was unemployed. I was a student. That's the nature of it. And then later, full-time organizer. My employment was working for my people for nothing. You hear me? That's the best thing in the world. If you think money's everything, you can't sleep with it. You can't hug it. You can't love it. Now, money, you got to have some. Poverty's misery. I'm not talking that. You know what I mean? But the greatest joy of my life was to be able to just be involved in a movement where it was my people. That was the sole thing. And that was the best education and the best love affair of my life. By the way, I like to say this, I love my people more than I love myself. My wife, I told her that. She said, oh, that's wonderful. I said, but don't think I'm a fool. That's in the group, not individually. It ain't everybody lovable just because you Black. You know what I'm talking about? So we defeated the supermarkets. We defeated the auto road dealers. We could buy Cadillacs, but we couldn't work to sell one. And I'm talking about all cars, you know. We defeated the milk companies, the soft drink companies, and then we took on the biggest of all, the banking industry. And we took on the biggest bank in the world, the Bank of America. We should not have been able to beat them. They used to be called the Bank of Italy. You know what I mean? But we whipped them. 3 months negotiations, 3 months demonstrations. And so when we defeated the Bank of America, I get a frantic call from Wells Fargo, the president of Wells Fargo, one of the biggest banks in the world. He had a shaky voice and he said, if you could beat the biggest bank in the world, you could beat us. We're hiring. So that was a case of winning without a fight. You know what I mean? But that's a case, that's no great strategy because you intimidate your enemy. That's not real good winning without a fight. That's an art. Just beating somebody down and someone else falls, that's, you know, that's okay, but that ain't the art. So the key point is that in these victories, we were establishing something. And the main reason we could make these victories is because we underwent a transformation of consciousness. We began to hit the books and know our enemy. And by the way, at the end of this set of victories, a Methodist minister called me into his office, and he had been observing the movement. And what he said was, y'all entered the movement like David against Goliath. All you had was a slingshot. And then you ended up slaying Goliath. And I had to laugh. It wasn't a slingshot. It was a series of strategies, but I got his point. So these victories were the product of us hitting the books, doing our homework. And so Marcus Bookstore became our finishing university. That was the place where we went to get our books. That's where we did the reading. And those in the movement that didn't read couldn't lead. Reading is the key to leading. You hear me? And some of our people don't like to hit the books. Well, if you don't like to hit the books, you're in trouble. Or in Black Studies, they take courses, but after they take their courses, they don't read anything else. Real reading is lifelong reading. You hear me? And it's self-education. It's not based on whether you get a degree or not, though it's good if you get one. So my real undergraduate education was a Black freedom movement, but my advanced PhD was earned at Marcus Bookstore, and my two teachers there were Ray Richardson, who became chair of Black Studies, Professor Ray Richardson, and Julian Richardson. And by the way, Dr. Wade Nobles and Dr. Asa Hilliard, that was their university. And our big professor was Julian Richardson, and he would say to Asa Hilliard, because he had a photographic memory, he read a book twice, what are you going to do with that knowledge? And then he said to me, when you read a book, you digest it. And that's true, you know what I mean? And so, and Wade Nobles, the same thing. Dr. Wade Nobles, that was his university. And there was no place to teach us this, but more important, no place to miseducate us in this, because we were getting it straight from the horse's mouth, from the masters who had come before us. And so this was the key to the lessons we learned, and the most invaluable were who we were and who we are. And the most valuable of that is to love ourselves. As Kwame Ture, who was a good friend of mine, Stokely Carmichael, said, he learned to love himself from everyday Black folks in Mississippi. I led the Black Nationalist Wing in C.O.R.E. He led the Black Power Wing within S.N.C.C. So the San Francisco Freedom Movement did much more than this. I won't go into it. The key thing for the purpose of Black Studies is we had demonstrations against the hotel and restaurant industry. Dick Gregory came down and got arrested. We have pictures of him and the rest of us in jail, and he gave a lot for the movement. And in the course of this, we had students from UC Berkeley and San Francisco State. The students from San Francisco State, while in jail, conceived of the experimental college. And the experimental college is the womb out of which Black Studies was born. Most BSU members don't know this. They know the experimental college was something they took over under the BSU. They took over the tutorial programs operating in Black communities under the experimental college, run largely by white students, but they don't know that it was a Black freedom movement that mothered this. And so the first Black studies courses were not taught after the strike. They were taught in the experimental college by Sister Sonia Sanchez, whose two twin sons I named. A master poet, and Brother Petrie, who's very insightful, had suggested we do a thing together, and that I look forward to that. That's one beautiful sister, and by the way, a member of C.O.R.E. That's her most valuable organizational experience, and later she joined the Nation of Islam for a period of time. Beautiful little sister, pack of dynamite. You hear me? So she taught in the experimental college, master poet. Amiri Baraka, one of the major leaders of the Black arts movement. He taught there. And Askia Muhammad Toure, not only a poet, but a master thinker who wrote a book that won the National Book Award called From the Pyramids to the Projects. Some of us just want to know about the projects. We're not concerned about the pyramids. Anyone else who had built them would want to claim them, would be going there every year. But we go to France, we go to Germany, we go anywhere but the pyramids. Of course, conscious Black people go to the pyramids, you know what I mean? Who wouldn't, if they know what it means? So the Black arts movement, which these particular artists were leaders of, got to grow on the West Coast and provided some of the initial scholars that taught in the experimental college, which is the womb out of which Black studies emerges at San Francisco State. And I want to say that it was the students, the Black students, and particularly the Black Students Union, that helped orchestrate this. They played major role in seeing that these scholars were on campus. And for the first year, Sonia just told me a week and a half ago, they taught in the English department for free. Can you imagine? Think about that, for free. Huh? Best scholars, artistic scholars on the planet for free. And then after that, they hired them. I mean, wasn't that nice? So this is the womb for Black studies. Now, at San Francisco State, you had a period between 1963 and 1966 in which Black student consciousness began to develop. And a lot of this comes from a article that I wrote in the Journal of Black Studies, which was the first journal I set up when I became chair. And then Dr. Sharuda extended that and called it the Black Studies Journal. And I interviewed in this particular issue all the leaders of the strike at San Francisco State. And this was in prior to 1982. Nathan Hare, Benny Stewart, Jerry Bernardo, who just passed on, and a number of others. And so what I'm saying here comes from those interviews, you know, straight from the horse's mouth. And it's the only study of the strike done by a Black person, you hear me, in writing. The others have been written by the government or by so-called white scholars. So in interviewing them, I uncovered the fact that between 63 and 66, the students' consciousness was undergoing change at San Francisco State. It was a reflection of the change in the Black community. And they were undergoing a transformation from Negro to Black. And so as they began to shift, then the name of the Negro Student Association, which had been a very conscious group, at least a good part of it, changed. But those who didn't like it left. But then it began to grow and become the Black Students Union. So that this was important. Now, the members of what becomes the Black Students Union are influenced by the Black Freedom Movement. And they're influenced by movements that are occurring around the country. One of the movements that's important, that's often neglected, is the Black arts movement in the Bay Area. Just as Sonia Sanchez and Askia Muhammad Toure and Miri Baraka taught at San Francisco State, you had a burgeoning Black arts movement in San Francisco and in the Bay Area. And the leaders of those were, among others, a brother named Aubrey Labrie, who later became an attorney. And he's still alive. In fact, he gave me a lot of his books. I have them in my library and in my garage. I'm trying to figure out how I bring them in to my study, because there's so many of them. He put out a magazine called Black Dialogue Magazine. Here, you see Huey Newton on a gunny. That was the shootout that occurred between Huey and the police. This was a magazine of Black political consciousness. And he helped shape the thinking of Black students at San Francisco State. And then you had a brother named Joe Goncalves, who was also chair of the education committee of San Francisco C.O.R.E, a good friend of mine. And this is his, it's now called Kitaba Chajua, originally the Journal of Black Poetry. And he was a student at San Francisco State. Wrote the introduction to my book, The Political Legacy of Malcolm X, one of the smartest people I've ever known. You hear me? And so the ideas they were shaping and their consciousness influenced the consciousness of students at San Francisco State. And they were calling on Blacks to draw from their historical past, learn lessons from them, and use them to organize in our community, to empower our people. Now, Dr. Nathan Hare, who this lecture series is dedicated to, was fired from Howard University, for his commitment to Black ideas and Black consciousness. And some criticism he raised when issues came up about Howard possibly becoming a white university. And as he began to criticize that, he began to come under criticism. And for a lot of other reasons, his militancy led to his firing at Howard University. It was a BSU that called on him to come to San Francisco State and to become the chair of the first Black Studies department before there was really a department. And so he did. And one of the things he observed when he came on campus, and I'm quoting him, he said, he observed the confidence of Black students to run things, because we have been running things all over the country. And that spread to the consciousness of Black students. They had seen us defeat an economic power structure. They had seen King leading a movement that defeated Southern apartheid, segregation, and the denial of the right to vote. And they had learned from a group called the Afro-American Association. See, there's a lot of different groups that lay out and come out of the Black community that contribute to this high level of consciousness. And the Afro-American Association was organized by a lawyer named Donald Worden, later called Al Mansour. Brilliant guy who came out of UC Berkeley, Bolt Law School. And some of the people in his association, you want to see how heavy he was? Huey P. Newton, Black Panther Party, Maulana Karenga. Petrie, do you know this? Karenga's origin comes out of the Afro-American Association. You want to know Karenga, know the Afro-American Association, and particularly know Donald Worden, because there's a lot of things in the way he operates. That's Donald Worden. These are some heavyweights, you hear me? And then Ronald Dellums, who I radicalized in the San Francisco Freedom Movement, he was a member of the Afro-American Association, and a brother who later becomes a judge named Ramsey, and a host of others. This group created a bunch of heavyweights, and I debated El Mansour, Donald Worden, and beat him too, but it was hard. I had to get former members to brief me. I don't go to no debate unprepared, because he had done some things I didn't like, but I liked him overall. Good brother, you know what I mean? Conservative, but a good brother. So the association the Afro-American Association inspired students at San Francisco State, Black students, to study their history and their culture. And so, as Benny Stewart said, at San Francisco State, Benny Stewart was the head of the Black Students Union during the strike, good brother. Benny Stewart said that at San Francisco State, Black students were well-read and well-informed. And he said they were replicas of Malcolm X and Donald Worden. See, now that's give people their due. You hear me? In other words, they could take on any professor at San Francisco State and intellectually clean their clock. That wasn't that hard either, you know what I mean? But they were sharp because their sharpness came out of the consciousness of their community. Great movements produce great consciousness. You hear me? So the San Francisco State strike for Black studies came after the San Francisco State administration failed to comply with the BSU demands after Dr. Hare had laid out a curriculum that we still use in Black studies, though we've revised it. So they find themselves going from meeting to meeting with administrators and given the runaround, promise one thing in one meeting and given nothing in the next meeting. And so they get tired. And so they put forward a series of demands and they go on strike to get those demands met. Benny Stewart made this comment about their inspiration for the strike, their strategic and tactical and intellectual inspiration. And this is what he said, I'm quoting him. When we look at King, we see that he was the spark. King brought out the contradiction. That is the opposition between the bull counters, you know, and the movements that King and S.N.C.C and other groups put forward. King, and this is a real good observation on his part, King came out with a methodology, approach, or technique, and this is a key point, with a minimum of casualties. Very important, very important. He got knocked for that in the 60s. Oh, he's nonviolent. What kind of man is nonviolent? Well, they didn't criticize Nkrumah for having a peaceful nonviolent movement, and he got the independence of his country with a minimum of casualties. What do you want? You want bloodshed when it's not necessary? You know what I mean? So he's saying the methodology came from King, but then he said the spirit came from Malcolm. He said, we learned from Malcolm to demand what we wanted and to take no jive and go get it. That was the spirit of the youth. And that was the spirit of the Black Panther Party too, you know, understand? Because in the beginning, Malcolm was a major influence on the Black Panther Party. So the San Francisco State strike went from November 6, 1968 to March 21st, 1969. It was the first Black student strike for Black studies, and it was the longest. It was not easy. If you see some of the pictures on the strike, you see the blood that some of these kids shed for this department. It achieved the following things. First, it achieved a Black Studies department with the jurisdiction over all existing Black Studies courses. That was important, A. B, it got the promise from the administration of 12 full-time professors, where there had only been one before. That was Nathan Hare. Next, they got the authority to grant a bachelor's degree in Black studies. They got the right to hire and fire faculty in the department with, at this time, the consent of what they call the Community Review Board. And they already had 128 students on campus admitted. And this is one of the reasons for the strike, is there's hardly no Black students there. And I know when I went there was a handful and no Black faculty. A considerable increase of students was demanded for the fall and was achieved. And they got a new administrative position for co-director of financial aid to better meet the needs of poor Black students. Now remember, San Francisco State you got a degree a year for $100 a year. Think about that one. You hear me? So a Black man was hired for the position for head of financial aid. The students also demanded amnesty for 90% of the students arrested. They also demanded, because as the Black students went into motion, students of color came on board and supported that campaign. And so what happens then is we get attached to the Black Student Union demands the creation of a College of Ethnic Studies. And so in addition to this, we get La Raza Studies, Third World Studies, Asian American Studies, Native American Studies. So that was a major achievement, because then at the university level, you have a College of Ethnic Studies that is a rare thing. But at the same time, there were losses. The BSU and their supporters achieved a great victory. First Black Studies department at a four-year university, but the losses were they didn't keep Nathan Hare as chair. George Murray was the triggering issue for the strike. Murray had been Minister of Education for the Black Panther Party. He taught English in the English department, had been fired. This was a triggering issue of the strike, but he was not rehired. Not all of the students who were arrested got amnesty. A few of them went to jail. So it wasn't a perfect victory, but it was still a great victory. You got the first Black Studies department at a four-year university in the United States. That was a major achievement. So when people like myself come in, and I started teaching at San Francisco State in 1972 as a lecturer at the lowest pay, $800 a month. Of course, at that time, you could rent I had a 1,400 square foot flat for $200 a month. So understand, the 70s, the pay grades were different, but I was at the lowest of the pay grades. You hear me? And the only reason why I got to teach at San Francisco State is two Black women, Ray Richardson and S.N.C.C. Ray, who had been my teacher before, and S.N.C.C. who chaired the dance department. The FBI had denied me a teaching credential at Marin. They filed a 17-page report and had the nerve to send it to me. That said, I'm denied a teaching credential because I'm a criminal. I was arrested 18 times, 16 San Francisco Freedom Movement, 2 in the South, for misdemeanors. I could have beat it. I'm going to Sacramento to challenge it. My spirit said no. I always listen to the spirit. I turned around. 3 or 4 years later, I'm hired at San Francisco State. And then the FBI is really out to get me. A guy named Garrity, who was provost at San Francisco State, was orchestrating an acting dean in the College of Ethnic Studies to write me up. Now, here's the thing about me. When I became chair, my dean, Dean Philip McGee, best dean we ever had, told me, you're the only faculty in the whole college and never a single complaint has ever come from a student. So these were manufactured complaints. I'm a researcher. So every time they hit me, I hit them back, clean my file up. And then Dr. Asa Hilliard was in charge of my HRT committee. You hear me? And he went to bat for me. And the community went to bat for me. And so we kicked the FBI's behind. And one of my favorite sayings when I got into class was, this was exaggerated, but I'd say, if the system was dumb enough to hire me to teach you, to radicalize you, then praise the Lord. But I was really exaggerating it because they didn't want me. We beat them. And Dr. Asa Hilliard was a major reason. That was one beautiful brother. And I don't say it because he supported me for tenure. I say it because he was a beautiful brother. I never heard a person say a negative thing about Asa Hilliard. For people who don't know who he was the only Black dean at San Francisco State. He later had an endowed chair at Georgia State University, was one of the best read Black men I knew, or people, period, and was one humble, kind, gentle, loving person, you know? And so I owe a lot to him, as well as to my community. So when I came in and others came in to deal with Africana, what was then Black studies, we had a challenge, because while we had a curriculum on the books provided by Dr. Nathan Hare, a very good curriculum, we had to go up against the miseducational system. And we have to overturn that to make sure that our students got an education for liberation, not an education for the plantation. And so what we had to really go up against was what had been set up in the Mohawk Conference held in Mohawk, Ulster County, New York, June 4th, 5th, and 6th, 1890. I don't know how many people are familiar with this conference. This was a conference that set up the educational policy for re-enslaving Black people through miseducation. It was presided over by Rutherford B. Hayes, prior president of the United States, who got elected into office on the promise that he would return us to a new slavery by disenfranchising us, by setting up a Jim Crow system in the Hayes-Tilden Compromise of 1876. And so he's chairing the conference. That's kind of like the fox in the hen house. All the hens are going to get eaten. You hear me? And so as he presides over this conference is addressed by one person who was most important of all the addressees. His name was General Armstrong. Armstrong was the founder of Hampton Institute, which trained Booker T. Washington. And he was Booker T. Washington's teacher. And so this was really the premise on which miseducation was founded, which Carter G. Woodson addressed in his book, Miseducation of the Negro. This is a new edition, beautifully bound and everything else. And so he said, the problem with the Negro is that he doesn't want to work. That's a problem for him, by the way. And he said, for a good reason, because he was forced to. And then he goes on to say the real objective of education for the plantation, or education for miseducation. He said, the goal of education, the goal that they would then call industrial education, but it became the goal of education beyond industrial education, according to Armstrong, was to get the Negro to want to work. In other words, it's kind of like saying, to get the slave to want to be a slave. It's almost like saying, to get him to make his own ship, to come over to America to pick cotton, you know what I mean? Voluntarily. So this was the project that we had to make sure our students were not ensnared in. You hear me? The project of miseducation. The problem that he posed wasn't that, and I'm using the term then, that the Negro didn't want to work. The problem is they didn't want to work for whites. And particularly, they wanted their own land, 40 acres of it at least one mule, so that they could grow their own crops, sell them, feed their own families, educate their children. And as a lot of Blacks coming out of the South would say then, so our children could get an education so they could read the contract so we wouldn't get stole from. You know what I mean? That was the practical stuff that they wanted right away. And they had reason to want it. 170,000 Union soldiers had kicked the behind of the Confederacy. Black people won the Civil War. They were losing until then. But when Blacks got their Winchester rifles or whatever kind of other rifles they got
they made their slave masters holy. And as one Southern white man said, it's only when the Negroes got into the battle that we started losing. You're darn right. Why? Because the baddest warrior on the planet is a black man and a black woman, because I'll tell your sister's about as bad as us. And some of these Civil War warriors were sisters disguised as brothers, though most of them were brothers. You hear me? And so we came out of the Civil War rambunctious. We weren't taking no orders. We got that vote only because they had to give us, because the South wanted to continue to win the war politically. And so we weren't willing to work for white people. And if we did, it was on our terms, and we'd leave if we didn't like the job. You understand? And so this Mohawk conference was about how to contain that, to contain Black labor. And so when we looked at Black studies as we came in, that the students had created through the strike, the department that Nathan Hare had set up, we knew that we were going up against a system of miseducation designed for the psychological control of our people. And the Mohawk Conference set out to create two educated groups, really miseducated groups of Blacks, Black preachers and Black teachers. Doesn't mean that all the teachers were miseducated. And it certainly doesn't mean all the preachers were, because there were two types. Those that came out of the Black culture and those that were trained by whites. They were very different, those two. So then the problem was, and this was the problem created by the Mohawk Conference, was to create a system of miseducation where you're taught the philosophy, history, literature, politics, and economics of your white oppressor, where you're taught that you have no history, you've contributed nothing to humanity, and so you're taught to hate yourself, and then you're taught to go out to your people and lead them. And since you've been alienated from them, there's not a thing you can do to lead them. You don't even want to, and you don't want to know anything about yourself. And so this miseducational system is the system described by Carter G. Woodson. And that the miseducational project that he defined in Miseducation of the Negro was aimed at college-educated Blacks, to teach them everything about the white man, to worship him, and to teach them everything negative about Black folks, to hate them. And this was not just the project here, it was a missionary project in Africa. It was a project in the Caribbean. And so this project, if it continued, would create for Blacks Oreos, Black on the outside, white on the inside. And for ethnic studies, for Asians, bananas, yellow on the outside, white on the inside. For Latinos, coconuts, brown on the outside, white on the inside. And for Native Americans, apples, red on the outside, white on the inside. And that project was there for every group. That was the American system. It's called assimilation. And King, by the end of his life, said that was pollution. He had to quit talking about that. So when I was hired at San Francisco State University, then my concern was that we have a curriculum that could enable our students to draw from their native gifts, and we could help polish it so that they could then take those native gifts back into the Black community and aid in the liberation of the community. By the way, my habit as a teacher, a professor, was to teach and organize. And I've done that for the 40 years. They were both. Students suffered because for at least 10 or 15 years, I didn't have time for office hours, but they could call me at home anytime they wanted to, because my office hours was in the community, you know? So with the help of Dr. Asa Hilliard and with the help of Dr. Wade Nobles, Lawford Goddard, Dr. James Todd, Dr. Theophil Obenga, Dr. Dorothy Saruta, Dr. Siri McDougall, who came in later, Dr. Phil McGee, who was our dean and one of the best deans, the best dean we had, and one of the architects of the Black psychology movement. We set about the task of teaching our students that this was an education for liberation. Every student that took my class remembers one question I ask all of them: what are you going to do with this knowledge to help your people? And that was a question that led many people to think about the purpose of their education. And I want to just say this: I'm really proud, and I think each professor, if they were here, and some of you already have this, I know Professor Petrie has this already. I'm proud to have had students who took their knowledge and then took it to another level. I had a student who rolled her babies into class, Carolyn Hodge. She was nearly 40, 2 little babies, one of whom's a lawyer now, the other one has a MBA. And she took Black Studies. And then she went on to become chair of Black Studies at Contra Costa College. You understand? And her students would come back to me. And they were so rigorous in their discipline that I had to tighten up, because I realized that she was following my course and she was tougher than I was becoming. And so I had to go tighten up. And one of these students that got me to tighten up, she was a Jewish American, went on in her 70s to get a Ph.D. You hear me? Huh? And she wasn't the smartest student either, but she was disciplined. And she got that from Carolyn Hodge. You hear me? Beautiful sister. I had a student from UC Berkeley, Ricky Vincent, who had been an astronomy major. So he decided to come over here to San Francisco State because he didn't see what the stars had to do with Black people. And so we hooked up in a class, and Ricky Vincent ended up writing a book that is an award-winning book that I have right here called Funk. You hear me? And this book has been translated into 4 or 5 different languages. And George Clinton wrote the introduction, the president of Funkadelic. And if you see any interviews on TV on the music, Ricky Vincent has established himself as an expert on the music. Yeah. And so that's one of my specialties and loves, but this is his passion. He got his PhD on the dance group that comes out of the Black Panther Party. That was his dissertation at UC Berkeley. And so we had a host of students like that, one of whom has taught at San Francisco State, Thabiti Mtambuzi, who became president of San Francisco State's Associated Students and told me he was going to become a millionaire. He's a multimillionaire. And he's a community activist. He wears dreads. If you see him, he looks like he's broke. Drives used cars, because that's what anybody with money knows to do. Don't put no money in no car. You know what I mean? And has helped us run a school, an independent Black school in which his son, daughter, and granddaughter have graduated from. A school in which 90% of our students, African Children's Advanced Learning Center, has been in operation 50 years, go to college. And 50% get scholarships, including his granddaughter. So that's been part of the pride of teaching. By the way, one of the books I wrote, Integration Trap, Generation Gap, came from a student asking me a question I couldn't answer. And that led to a book. Ignorance led to knowledge. So my students have taught me sometimes what I didn't know, and it led me to try and know. And that's a humbling experience. But then when you get something out of it, it's really rewarding. So the key mission of the Black Studies curriculum, growing out of the Black freedom and Black power movement, was to get our students to know that our downfall, any people's downfall, is based on their failure to know and respect their historical origins. When a people think their historical past doesn't matter, they will think that they don't matter, and they'll have no vision for their future. When you know that you have had a great historical past, you know that you have a great historical future. And so in carrying out the discipline of Black Studies and expanding it, the central course offerings in the discipline had to spin in the Black Studies phase around history. Malcolm X, which the strike drew its spirit from, said of all studies, history is best designed to reward our research. And he made the point, he said he never knew a Black person who hated Africa and loved themselves. That if you're the fruit and you don't love the root, you're in dead trouble. You hear me? And anyone that doesn't know their roots hasn't got a sense of their purpose, their potential, and what they can achieve in life. And that's not just true of history, but the history of anything. If you're getting into a relationship, you need to know the history of your partner. History is key. And so this was key in terms of seeing that the discipline produced change for our people. So the key to this knowing our history, that key opens us up to knowing ourselves. Self-knowledge is the real purpose of education. Self-knowledge. The education for miseducation is an education for work. That was the point of the Mohawk Conference, was to go to school just to get a job. And most of our students still think that's the purpose of education. That was the second message I had to all my students. If you think the purpose of education is a job, then you might as well go back to the plantation, because that's what they brought you here for, to work from can see to can't see. Your purpose is to work for your people. Your purpose is to know yourself and do something to make life better for those around you, your people and humanity. And I had a student who sat in the back of my class and then came to class years later in a dashiki. And he said, I used to think you were crazy. And I worked on Wall Street and I made a lot of money and they fired me because of that. And then I realized that knowing yourself is the most important thing. Now, he was taking a white studies class on African history and had a dashiki on. But he got half the message, you know what I mean? That he gone through that job thing and found out that number one, he couldn't make all the money. And I think that's what caused him to wake up. It wasn't that he got my message. It was, when you don't get our message, they'll hit you upside your head and you'll get a message. You know what I mean? That opened his eyes up. So when you know your historical origins of roots, then you have a sense of who you are. When you don't, you're functionally illiterate. And I'm wrapping up here. Those of us with PhDs, masters, or any kind of degrees that don't know ourselves, we're functionally illiterate. We got a lot of information about stuff that doesn't have any application to us and don't have any knowledge that we can apply to our own betterment. In most cases, we live in misery. Most cases, we can't even stand to be by ourselves. And the only thing we got are those external things, but nothing internal. So when you know that African people, Black people, gave birth to the greatest civilization in the world, Kemet, called Egypt, Kemet meaning land of the Black people, you will know why Black people in the US are the most creative people on the planet. We are that without even knowing our roots. African-American culture is the culture of popular choice in the world, the ethos of the African-American. By the way, we spent as much time in this discipline on our culture here as we did over there, but we needed to know the root to know the fruit. And so when you understand that the ethos, which is the way people carry themselves, their approach to living, and we have a unique ethos of Africans anywhere in the world, when you understand that that ethos is creativity, we never like to do the same thing the same way twice. And that's one reason why when we wield power, we can wield it effectively. But when you know where that creativity comes from, then you got some real power. You hear me? So when you know that, you know why you think hieroglyphically like the Egyptians. I was down at Morehouse College and a rapper was telling me that the way he comes up with rapping is through dreams. It's the pictures that come in his dreams. You understand? That's called hieroglyphic thinking. And you know us, what's our favorite word? The Spirit told me this. The Spirit told me that. That's us. You hear me? And that's the God within each one of us. So when we understand this, it inspires us to do great things today and tomorrow. So I want to end this by saying that Black studies and now Africana studies has the task of in educating our people, our young people, and some older, because not all of our students are young. That education has got to be about revitalizing and empowering our communities. That has got to be the key thing. Revitalizing and empowering our families, strengthening them that are weakened. Giving a sense of purpose to young people, some of whom now have a sense of no purpose. And that's why suicide rates are rising in the Black community. Africana studies now is a safe haven for some of our people who don't find it in their own communities. And it's a home away from home, and sometimes the home for our students because of the ravages that have hit the youth. So this is the task we have. And so I'm thankful to the students, to Dr. Nathan Hare, who, by the way, was the first hire that I carried out when I was chair. And I tried to line up a tenure for him. It didn't work, but I tried. We owed it to him. A beautiful brother, you know. So to them, we say thank you for what you did. And for our students, we say, you got to pass the torch. Take this knowledge, internalize it, and practice it. So that's it. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Dr. Tashaka. This was a really powerful presentation, and you spoke to the core of what the series is about when you mentioned, where we mentioned Black power, because Black power is the origin, the source from which things come. So certainly, thank you. But I want to open up. We couldn't close out. I'm sure we have to take at least one or two questions. So any questions that you might want to ask Dr. Tashaka, feel free to raise your hand or put it in the chat section, and I will grab it really quick. We'll take at least two questions. Comments, any comments that you want to make? Questions or comments?
I'll make a comment if possible.
Yes, jump right in.
Hi, Dr. Tashaka. I just wanted to say hello. I was your student in the late 70s and early. You probably can't see me well, but this is Tammy. You called me Nzinga, and I was part of P.A.P.O, and I'm also a graduate of Black Studies. I guess one question just in regards to Black Studies, and I know now it's called Africana Studies. Just curious how it has developed. I know at that time, I got my degree in behavioral and social sciences. So at that time, we actually had a concentration in Black studies. So I was just wondering if that has continued. But also, I first want to just, before I ask that question, I do want to say thank you for everything that you have taught me and that I continue to use. Believe it or not, this was one of my books. I don't know if you can see it. Black Activism was one of our books from one of the many classes. You mentioned Jerry Bernardo. I didn't know he had passed, but one of the things that we had to do was actually go out and interview the architects of the strike, and he was the one that I actually had to interview, and we became good friends over the years. He was a mentor. So there's a lot, you know, Dr. Ray Richardson, Dr. Maxwell, Dr. McGee, all those people I remember, but I just wanted to be here, and, you know, it was just nice seeing you and nice hearing you. I thought I was in class again 40 plus years later.
So you're describing the project that led to the article that I was quoting, which was interviewing the strikers. And it was a number of students that went and helped carry out those interviews. In terms of Africana studies, I think Dr. Petrie can provide the definitive answer. I know that we've always encouraged, if students are not majoring in Africana or Black studies before that, to have concentrations. So we've encouraged that.
And there's been a development of the discipline since Black Studies, particularly in the 2000 period, which led to what is now called Africana Studies. And when we do the second part of this, I'm going to go into that. So there has been an evolution of the discipline, but it's been based on the premise that to be Black is to be African. So we're not throwing the baby out with the bathwater, you know. We're building on what we already had, but new conditions have occurred in the Black community, in some places where we have no communities at all anymore, that call for new measures, academically and otherwise. And so that's called for a deepening of the discipline, because it's always got to respond to the needs of our people. So there's been a deepening of the discipline.
And there's another hand up, Barry. So Barry, you have the floor.
You gotta unmute. Take your mute, can't hear you.
Right.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you now.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, Dr. Tashaka, thank you so much. I learned a lot from your class. I'm over here in Washington, D.C. And because of the knowledge I got from you, when I first came here, I started working for federal government. Anytime California, San Francisco apply for grants, I gave you #1. You know, since I came here, I have shipped more than $1 billion in federal grants to San Francisco and California. And it's all thanks to you. The knowledge you gave us, empowerment. So I thank you so much. I've been waiting for opportunity to thank you. And if there's any way we can get your email, that would be great.
Yeah, my email is Tashaka, OTSHAKA @ SBC